Welcome to the locker room. Around the table today, we got Lib, Rod.
Hello.
And Brent Becker.
Great to have Brent.
It's so good to have Brent. Brent, so right now you've been our interim student ministries pastor, but you've also been super involved with men's ministry discipleship for a long time. You've personally blessed my life in many ways. You've blessed the life of this church. But I want to get to know you a little bit, just for those that maybe haven't had the privilege of spending time with you in the ways that we have. So tell us a little bit about kind of your upbringing, your journey to Christ, and what that was like.
Sure, will do. So my parents are missionaries. I was born in South Korea, so kind of lived the first half of my life as an MK on the field, and didn't realize what an incredible experience it was and gift, but loved that. My parents were part of Campus Crusade for Christ, huge part of the revival that happened in South Korea back in the 70s or so. So just wild to see some of the legacy of their investment in that space. Moved to Southern California kind of midway through middle school, which was traumatic to say the least. And
in what way?
Oh man, Southern California has its culture all in of itself. So I'm coming from South Korea and I think I'm cool, and I show up in Southern California and I realize I'm everything but, and just definitely I got taken for a ride. It was wild. Just a completely different culture. And yet it was in the milieu that God got a hold of my heart.
Yeah.
And just kind of all this, the games I've been playing in Christendom of like walking and doing the altar calls.
Yeah.
And God finally saying, no, I got you now. And so I was really into that space, and really kind of a cool revival God was doing even amongst the surfing community and everything in that Southern California area, just to be a part of what was going on there. And just
Were you a surfer?
Again, I was trying to fit in every possible way, so I was a poser in every arena. So
I'm sure there was a lot of posers in that setting.
It
right?
is.
Yeah, you weren't alone.
Everybody's trying to be something they're not.
You do still have a little bit of a surfer twang to your speech.
I appreciate
a little bit of
that.
Southern California in you.
Bruh.
Wait, so how old were you when you moved to Southern California?
So I was start of 8th grade,
Okay.
so 13 years old.
So before that, all your time was spent in South Korea?
And the Philippines.
Okay.
Yeah, kind of a crazy story. My dad had been maligned by some of the folks in the ministry, and they had asked him to leave South Korea. And then 4 years later, they confessed that they had lied because they were jealous of him. And so the ministry asked him to come back to Korea.
Wow.
And he had the humility to accept the forgiveness, or to offer forgiveness, and then to go back and continue to serve in Korea. So
Wow.
Did you understand what was going on?
Not at all.
Okay.
It wasn't until actually after I graduated from college, I went to a conference, an international conference for crew, and the story started to come out of what my parents had gone through, and it was just mind-blowing to see their lives and legacy of faith.
How did that experience now looking back, inform just the way that you worked out your own faith? Because I'm sure that was pretty transformative to say, wow, look at what my dad and mom did.
You know, it's one of those things. They were some of the first missionaries that Crusade sent overseas, and like literally were on a boat to China. Like they took the boat.
Yeah.
It's one of those things when you're living it, you don't see the beauty and the power of the people you're around, right? It becomes so familiar, and it breeds a level of contempt, right? And then you get to see them from a removed perspective, and I think it just was awe-inspiring. Just the life of faithfulness, the courage to go and serve. I mean, they're both Midwesterners. My dad was a farm boy from Indiana, and for them to pick everything up and move to Korea, it really is incredibly encouraging and inspiring. It's really why we went to South America from 2011 to 2016. I wanted my kids to kind of have a similar experience, learn a different language, eat different food, but see that God is so much bigger than we make him, I think, in our Western mindset here, and see what he's doing in other parts of the world.
So where'd you guys go?
We're in Quito, Ecuador.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Wow.
So.
And then what are your connections to Grand Rapids? Because we've got Korea, Southern California, Philippines.
Quito, Ecuador.
Yeah, so it's kind of wild.
And now you just landed here and
just
plain old
dropped right
white
in Grand
bread,
Rapids. Absolutely.
Grand Rapids.
Well, it's funny because when I met my wife in college, she was really aiming at medical school, and I was heading into the pastorate, and just could not see how those two meshed. And so she put that on hold and pursued some other opportunities. While we were in South America, though, she said, I really feel like I want to go back to medical school. So I said, okay, let's give this a run. So she went through the whole process, took the MCAT, applied to schools, didn't get in the first round, applied a second round. And her sister, who actually lives in Grand Rapids, her and her husband work at an injection mold plastics company up in Belmont area, said, hey, why don't you apply to Michigan State? Because their downtown campus is their main one here in Grand Rapids, and you could come live next to us. And so she applied. It was the only school she got into. And so we just packed our bags and moved to Grand Rapids. So that was really our only connection, was her sister who lived just down the street. And so lo and behold, we did. We landed here, and ended up being the biggest gift for us, because in the midst of this chaos of our season, I always joke that most people go to medical school in their 20s when they're unattached. We decided to do it in our 40s with 4 kids. And so that created its own level of chaos. And so being able to be near family, have our kids be relatively located at their schools was a huge gift.
Yeah.
But it's pretty disorienting for me, because every move we'd done had been related to a job I'd had or ministry opportunity. And so we landed here, and Grand Rapids was a hard place to land.
Yeah. In what way?
People are very friendly here, but it's what I call 1 inch thick, like very, very kind. And then after that, everybody's got everything they need. Mm-hmm. Their families are here, their friends are here, their jobs are here. The deep roots are beautiful, but for somebody who is a transplant, it's hard to find their way into the community. Yeah. And so people were kind and nice, but nobody needed anything. And relationships, I believe, are based upon mutual shared needs. And so nobody had anything they needed. And so we had lots of needs. People were willing to meet those, but there was no reciprocation of that. And so it just created a bit of a barrier. Yeah. That was really hard to
So what
pass.
year was that?
2016.
2016. Oh, yeah, you just said that. Sorry.
So your wife was doing medical school, but what did you actually do when you came here? Because you were in the pastorate, you were missionary, and...
Oh, I flailed around. After wrapping up everything with our missions organization for the first several months, I ended up becoming a financial advisor. And that was a unique space to kind of step into that world. And the problem is it's all based upon your natural market. And so you have to basically contact your friends and family members. And for those who are well-rooted and established here in West Michigan, it's a relatively easy transition. But I had no natural market here. And so that was really tough. So after that, I ended up going to work for my brother and sister-in-law at their company, and I was their HR director for about 3 years. And that was hard, but a really beautiful experience. Yeah. These are folks who live, many of them, paycheck to paycheck. And I just got to know them, got to know their stories. We have a pretty strong Hispanic community there, so I got to use my Spanish, which I just loved. And I go back even now, and I go and visit them, and they give me big hugs when I walk on the floor. So that was a sweet season.
That's awesome.
But then I resigned from that when she started residency, just from the angle of I'd heard some of the horror stories of what doctors go through in residency, and we had made a commitment not to sacrifice our kids on the altar of our careers. So I pulled that back. We'd started a rental company. No, that's not true. A property management company. We were managing rentals. And so I went doing that full time, as well as I teach over at Grand Valley as an adjunct. So
wow.
That's amazing.
I wear so many hats. I'm not sure which one's on my head currently, but
Renaissance man.
So how did you end up at Crossroads? And then I want to get to where you're at right now.
Well, I'll just add in one little story.
Yeah.
Rod came home one day because I think it was a service that I hadn't been in, when he came home, and he just said, I just met the greatest guy this morning. He baptized his son, and he used to be a pastor, and wow, we just have an amazing church. Filled with amazing people that we don't even know exactly everybody's stories and gifts, and he was so encouraged after meeting you that day.
Yeah.
that was fun.
I was blown away.
That was
I
a
could
fun
not
morning.
believe what I was watching.
Yeah.
You with your son. It was, as we were getting ready to be baptized, the way you guys were talking, and the Christ-centered, and the love, the affection, and the maturity from your son at such a young age. I was just like, wait, this goes to Crossroads? Like,
Yeah.
It's right under our nose. And how long had you been going to Crossroads at that time?
Probably about 2 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And now here you are working with students, and it's the same experience, honestly. Like, you stepped into a space that was going through massive transition, our student ministry, and you just earned instant trust from leaders, parents, students, your teammates. Even when I hear how you minister to people, like if we're in a staff meeting and someone asks for prayer, and the way you step into that and how you step into it and the prayers that come out of your mouth, it's just, every time I'm just marked with, wow, I'm in the presence of a great man. So we're just really
Amen.
honored and grateful. I can circle back to as someone who grew up in Grand Rapids, you're 100% right on your assessment of it. The only thing I would say is that there actually is a lot of need.
Mm-hmm.
It's just stuffed away.
Yeah.
It's buried, and then people just apply performance on top of it. And so this community is really good at that. And if you have a broken arm, the whole community will run to it.
Yeah.
If you have a broken marriage, they don't know what to do. And I can say that. It's part of the reason why I'm a long way from my tribe in this community and why we're here in this city. God uses it all. You're one of us.
I am, and Crossroads is one of those outposts
Yeah, exactly.
in the midst of this space where I've found my people. It's been remarkable just to see people in the midst of their brokenness, seeking the Lord, finding Him, walk with them through hard spaces and believing that He is actually strong enough to carry them through it. And that's been the beauty of being in this space.
Love it.
Yeah. Well,
I want to just say one more thing too
go
about the
for
whole.
it.
But you said that you guys, when you first moved here, you had a lot of need, but it wasn't reciprocal. Like everybody else on the surface felt like they had great community with, and I'll attest to that. We have both sets of parents here, brothers, sisters. I mean, life is very full and beautiful. But I'll just speak for us at Crossroads. I'm so glad you're here because we definitely need you. I mean, you have needs, but we as a church need people like you, people that just bring all your gifts and everything you have without asking for much and just being willing to roll up your sleeves, step into spaces where there's voids. And I think that's one thing that I love about our church. Like, it's just filled with people that have gifts and they want to use them. So thank you. Thanks for putting your name in the hat, stepping in the ring, and just being willing to give.
That's been my absolute joy. It really has.
Ours too.
Thank you for creating space for that to happen.
And a quick assessment on this year, student ministry, how it's going. And
It's been an absolute joy. It's funny. I was looking at some notes I'd written after the first youth group, and I thought, oh my goodness, this place is absolute chaos. and I was like, I don't know.
Aren't youth areas always, not youth groups, but anything involving like a massive group of young people, slightly like orchestrated chaos?
As a student ministry pastor.
Oh yeah.
But this was very unique.
I've done it for 20 years. I've never seen anything like it. I was like blown away, and it's okay. We've got some work to do. The best part of it was the bones were good. An incredible group of leaders who just, I think, wanted to be led and directed and wanted some structure. And once it took a little bit to kind of gain their trust, so it wasn't as immediate as I'd hoped, but actually that was okay because I knew it had to be earned. And as it was, they really responded in a beautiful way, and they love these kids. They love them, and they love them well. And it's been wild just to walk alongside them. And for one of the things that I've kind of learned, kind of back to that performance issue, is I used to always have to be up front. And God has taught me some beautiful things about just loving the back. And I love watching other people flourish now. And it's been so fun teaching folks to teach, developing their gifts and skill set and releasing them to do it. It's been wild. It's been so fun. So I've loved it.
Yeah.
It's an incredible group of leaders. The students have people who walk alongside them and helping them see Jesus and just work through their own issues. Because kids today, they're not facing the same stuff we faced. The stuff that they're having to process is unlike anything we ever went through. And so just having men and women who love Jesus, who are walking with them through it, is more essential than ever. And the fact that we have such great leaders who are stepping into that space with them is huge.
Yeah. And Brent, sitting on this end of the year, at the beginning of the year, Libby knows this, I was going to take over just because there was a big vacuum and the chaos that you spoke about. And I spent 10 years as a youth pastor. So I'm like, okay, we're going to double down here. And for about a month, but I was just, as I got into it with the leaders, I was just like, I told Libby, I don't know how I'm going to be able to do both of these things. Yeah. And just the fact that you were there, took the baton, ran with it, and now here and looking back on this whole year, because I'm tired as it is. I don't know what would have happened.
You're the perfect person. God had the perfect person.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate Matt Kenny had a vision. He and I had been working together, and he said, "Hey, I know you've worked with some youth before. It's like, will you just come be a part of our crew?" And I was like, "Sure." And I had no idea what I was stepping into. And then shortly after, he's like, "Hey, do you want to run this?" I was like, "Okay." Yeah. So I mean, props to Matt and his willingness just to kind of see the bigger picture and kind of get everything going and up and running.
Huge.
Bring a team together.
Love it.
So
bless the Lord.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that when I think about your story now and the seat that you sit in today, but that journey that God brought you on, you've been in so many different vocations, we call it, but each one of them was marked by this desire to make disciples, whether it's being in property management, being a youth pastor, being an overseas missionary, doing financial advisor work. And it's just beautiful because that was one of the things that you put front and center for us on Sunday, Rod, just talking about the story of Jacob and Laban, just how much our work actually matters and how we've devalued it as a culture, or we've tried to create this bifurcation between our work and our spiritual lives. And so it's just the Lord's timing that you're at the table today, because you're a perfect example of someone that's trying to work this out in every inch of their life. And I get a sense that you were very, not that there weren't struggles, but that this was instinctive to you, that you weren't super concerned in those moments of what particularly you were doing every single day to earn income for your family, but that you were going to stay on mission with whatever you were doing. And I think that's just a beautiful representation of what you were trying to hit on, Rod. So as we close up Genesis and we focus on our series in Joy and then Ephesians, I think it's just a great stopping point, because life rolls on, and the most constant thing that we walk into every single day is our work. So when you think about work, Brent, and you think about all those seasons, was that a conscious decision that you made that, like, whatever I'm doing, it's going to be for the Lord? Or did you kind of fall into these scenarios where you found yourself in an opportunity to serve?
I think you're giving more credit than I deserve. I think it was more desperation than anything. I think, you get to a point where you're like, I got to provide for my family financially. What does that look like? And in a space where I tried to, my background is in education, I was trying to find a way to get into the schools to teach, and those doors shut pretty quickly. It was a matter of just trying to pivot in whatever way. But I think the cool thing about our gifts is wherever we are, we get the chance to leverage them. So it's not just simply in a church context. And, I reflected with my family, Rod, on something you said on Sunday that has been kind of a mantra for our families. Like the world doesn't need more pastors. I mean, pastors are wonderful. God bless them. Yeah. But we need are people who love Jesus, who are teachers and janitors and lawyers and doctors, and taking the heart of Jesus into dark places and shine the light in that space. And that's really been, I think, kind of the heart behind all of the desperation of just throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what sticks, seeing where God leads. But just kind of saying, God, what if being on mission means stepping into these spaces of work that aren't traditionally considered places of worship, and transforming them to be such? Yeah.
I mean, it's a game changer. It just gets us from this mindset that there's only a select few people that do ministry,
right?
And select few places where it happens, times and places, Sunday morning, our devotions, and it's just so Greek. It's ancient Greek way of thinking, when it's not God's plan, it's not biblical. Right. God wants a whole kingdom of priests We're all pastors.
Absolutely.
We're all missionaries. And if we can embrace that, then you get a mindset of, I'm not a businessman who happens to be a Christian. I'm not a teacher who happens to be a Christian. I'm actually a Christ follower first who happens to be a businessman. I'm a Christ follower who happens to be a teacher. That's a game changer if people can start understanding that and then living into it.
Well, because I've been in pastoral ministry full time. I've been a missionary full time. And then I've been an HR manager full time. And, one of these things is like, I've had the chance to experience each of these arenas and how people will idolize certain aspects of work. Like, oh, like you're really spiritual because of X, as opposed to, stepping in to a space where people are going paycheck to paycheck. That's where Jesus would be. That's where he rolls up his sleeves and walks with them through the loss of family members or the housing or needing medical care, things of that nature. And so people who love Jesus stepping into that space and being aware of his spiritual working and being willing to be agents of his grace in that arena are huge.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to something that you said. Could you expound just on how that way of thinking, the first way of thinking, is Greek? Like, where does that, because I'd love to overlay that on our culture today and maybe try to identify why we think this way.
Yeah. I mean, I've said it before. I learned this when I was in college, at Wheaton College, that in the Western world, the West being Europe, much of America, and what we're founded on, all traces its way back to the early Greeks, Hellenism. You had some huge thinkers from Plato to Socrates. But, I mean, there's hundreds of them. And you had a whole golden age and a renaissance that took place. And then you had Alexander the Great that went and conquered the world, but it wasn't just military. He was a missionary. He was trying to turn the whole world into making it Greek and planting these mini Athens everywhere he went. And that's still with us. In fact, even though the West has been Christianized, which pushed that mindset out a little bit, we still couldn't fully divorce ourselves from it. And now it's coming back in. And what's the it? Well, the it is this idea that there's a spiritual and a material world. And maybe there is, okay? But the Greeks said the spiritual world, the unseen world, was created by a good God, and therefore it's good and pure. And it was a demon that came along and created the material physical world. So to the ancient Greek, that was inherently bad. And this is why in the New Testament, the Greek thought of Gnosticism. This is what they're dealing with. We're these Gnostics that were thinking this way and even applying it to Jesus and applying it to spirituality, which then leads to you beat your body, you suppress your body, you deny your body. And there's parts of that are biblical, but at the end of the day, to draw these categories, this is good, this is bad, the physical is good, bad, the spiritual is good. We just apply it to so many things, and work is one of those things.
Yeah.
Even people that work in the spiritual world are considered more spiritual, and our work is considered more spiritual, when in reality it isn't. God cares about the material world very much, and he wants to redeem it. He cares about our bodies. In the end, he's going to resurrect them. And so therefore, to reduce this to just caring about a person's soul, we make that much more important than caring about a neighborhood. And yeah, God says, no, I care about all of it. I care about your soul, and I care also about the neighborhood and redeeming all of it. So if Christians can continue to just embrace and see, what's biblical, what's Greek and what's not biblical, and embrace a biblical mindset, I think it'll unleash us that much more, and we won't have these crazy thoughts that those people on Sunday morning on stage are more spiritual and doing more spiritual things than me and what I'm doing on Monday morning at my work. When you have such an opportunity to love God with your whole heart and love the people around you with your whole heart, and to be a light to the nations and be a disciple who makes disciples in any context, irrespective of where you are.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we can elaborate on the whole locker room metaphor, if you think about, in a sense, what Rod's saying, and the locker room being filled with a coach and a team, and if, for the sake of the metaphor, the pastor is the coach and the people here on Sunday mornings are the team, and then you actually go out and play the game, like, you can't say that the coach is the most important. Like, the people are the ones that are actually out on the field playing the game. And there would be no game without the people that are coming, hopefully on Sunday mornings, just to get pumped up for the real mission, which is the rest of the week, when you're in the environment to which God has called you. And we're heading into Pentecost next Sunday, and then a week of 24/7 prayer. But the Bible tells us that we are the temple of the Holy Spirit, that the Holy Spirit lives within us. And I know for me, sometimes I think about the very fact that every time I walk into a space, that the Holy Spirit is actually walking into that space because he lives within me. Mm-hmm. And the weight and the joy and the opportunity that we have to bring the very presence of God wherever we go, and in a very real, material, and spiritual way. It's not just that we have the right things to say, or that we, have a magic wand to make everything better, but we actually have the living, breathing Spirit of God living within us and walking into those spaces. He comes with us. I mean, he's already there, but he comes with us into those spaces, and we just get to live into that opportunity.
I'll give you guys a life example when this kind of hit me. It was my junior year of college. I traveled to Europe, youth hostel to youth hostel. And it was actually a ministry connected to the school called Youth Hostel Ministry. I mean, so every day I'd wake up and be like, who am I going to meet today? How am I going to share Jesus? And then I come back from that. And I'm umping softball games. It's summertime. And I'm just like, this is meaningless. Why am I doing this? And I just remember thinking, wait a second, it doesn't have to be. So every player that came to the batter's box, I just prayed for him. I just silently just prayed God's favor, God's blessing, that they would know God. And we can do that. You don't have to have a certain title or do a certain job to be able to pray for people, to love people, point them to Christ.
And even when you're striking them out, you're still praying.
Oh, man.
He
when
has
I
a
strike
loud
them
strike.
out, man.
You are out of there.
Rod, can't you give us one?
No, you're out.
We were first dating. Those first years of dating when you don't want to ever separate. We were in college, and Rod would have to go ump, and so I would be like, I'll come with you. So I would sit in the stands and watch Rod ump and listen to him calling people out and striking them.
Little did you know he was praying
Totally.
for him before that, right?
Yeah.
That's great.
So work and wages, I mean, we are consumed quite a bit with it, right? Both the work part and the wages part.
But I was also thinking how important it is, the material world and people going out. But Sunday morning is an essential part, because you get beat down
Huge.
pretty hard over the course of the week. And being reminded of what's true when you come back together is an incredibly important, essential part of because if we didn't need a coach, if we could do it on our own, we wouldn't need Sunday. But the coach is essential to be like, hey, don't forget, this is where we're headed. This is our goal. Remember, we worked on this. There's
Love
something so essential to both aspects, right?
Yeah.
We do need that space to be reminded and to be sent back out again.
Yeah. I mean, that's why we call it the locker room. Every team needs to be with the coach in the locker room, the coaches. And when you were saying that, I mean, I was just, okay, you teed it up for me to talk about Jim Harbaugh. But if you noticed, like Jim Harbaugh, after a game and they've had success, who does he talk about? The players. The players.
Yeah.
It's all about the players. But we need to gather, just like students need to gather, right? I mean, your gathering is important and instrumental to the student ministry.
Well, I think it's also about hearing from the coaches, but it's about looking. I love that we gather in the round, because it's like looking across and seeing all the people also that are in it with you. Like, we're all beaten down, but we come back together once a week to kind of know that we're not alone, and to be reminded of the goal, which is the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah, and to get instruction, which ultimately the place that we find ourselves in the text with Laban and Jacob doing what they're doing reminds me of, work was in the garden. God commanded and instructed Adam and Eve to rule and subdue. And then obviously we know how the whole story falls apart because they choose to decide good and evil on their own merit, their own ideas. But when I look at the story of Jacob and Laban, obviously they have the work component, which God ordained and commanded, but they're doing the way that they're seeking to achieve some sort of success is totally based off of their own ideas of what can actually gain what they want. And so Jacob continues to be the swindler that he is, and Laban obviously has been swindling Jacob, and all the while they're working, but their work is not worship. At least it's not worshipful. And so I'd just be interested to know what you thought about kind of that dichotomy between Laban and Jacob on Sunday morning and kind of what you see there.
It is so characteristic of God to take us in the midst of our sin and to expose us in such a uniquely profound way, right? Jacob and Rod, you kind of hinted at this or said outright, the very thing that Jacob did to his father, right, and to Esau is being done to him. And I wonder at what point that dawned on Jacob in this process, where he was being undermined and being taken for a ride like that. And even when you pulled in the story of the prodigal son and that moment with the younger son thwarting the older son and the father for the inheritance, and just there's such a beautiful, gracious work of God to expose us in our sin through something that is very identical to the very thing that we are guilty of doing to others.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful and it's painful to see it in that light, right? Because in some ways, nothing else gets at us than seeing our sin and our own tendencies displayed before us. I think that's why we have kids, right?
Yeah,
God
exactly.
gives us kids as mirrors to see our own brokenness and our sin.
And I would even go before we have kids, marriage. Marriage exposes it. Having kids exposes it. Being on a team, you start to see your own sin. But work is one of those places where our sin is exposed. Sins like bitterness.
Well, because you even talked about the nature of our idolatry of money and how that drives us. And I was thinking back, it's in the Psalms where he says, he talks about these workmen who take this half of wood and they form it into this idol, right? And they have to nail it down so it doesn't totter, but has eyes and does not see, and ears and doesn't hear. And the haunting line after it is, those who make them will become like them.
Exactly.
And so this idea that, and you reference this at the end of the message about how Laban is this hollow man.
Yeah.
And he's scrabbling through the tent to find his household idols. Yeah. And I've never thought of it in those terms, but he in essence is the natural conclusion of a life spent swindling people and idolizing material wealth.
Wow, I did not know that psalm existed. I wish I had it on Sunday, because that summarizes why he's a hollow man. You worship worthless things and you become worthless.
You become them, yes.
Right? And that is what happens over a course of a life.
And isn't it gracious? God gives Jacob the ability to see 20 or 30 years down the road of like, Jacob, if you continue this path, this is who you become.
That's exactly what's going on.
And Jacob going, let's go home.
Yes.
Let's go. I don't want that life.
So I approached this text not having looked at it a lot. And so I was assuming that Jacob, because he's still in Genesis 32, going to still have that old Jacob in him. So I just assumed he's still old Jacob, this whole text. But as I studied it, I started to see, wow, he's really starting to change. And I think you're right. He's looking at Laban and saying, is this the kind of person I want to be?
Yeah.
And he also has that experience at Bethel where God just revealed himself, and he probably has his dad and his grandpa in his mind and their walk with this Lord. And it's like, wow, maybe there's something to that. And so it's fun to see just the character development, the heart development in this duplicitous con man.
Yeah.
He's changing.
And you see it incrementally. Like you said, you pointed out, like, instead of coming to his aid, and he says to his wives, your dad's cheated me 10 times, but I've continued to faithfully engage. And it just almost seems like the normal Jacob, the original Jacob, would have pieced out. He would have been like, forget this. This is not worth it. And just that faithfulness as he continued to press into being swindled is part of God's sort of, I don't know, his fortitude being formed in him.
Yes.
That process.
And that's going to be vitally important, especially as he moves back into the promised land, because that's actually the greatest, sin is an exaggeration. I heard it said an exaggeration or diminishment of something good, right? So of course sin hollows you out, because the things that you fill yourself with can't fill you, right? It just reminds me of all the things that God says to Israel before Israel, the nation, moves into the promised land. Like, hey, I'm bringing you into a land with all these good things, but when you get there, you might forsake me because you're going to think that this is all on your own doing. And it reminds me of Romans 1. Like, there's actually a scenario whereby we get God's good gifts and we don't get God. Like, we can go down the path in our life where we stuff ourselves with so much of God's good gifts that we completely abandon him. And that's actually the greatest judgment of all. And it reminds me of Cornelius Plantinga. Yeah, he's professor over at Calvin. I have to quote this. I know I've quoted it before, but it's so good. He says, pride is first and most popular form of idolatry, but all forms of idolatry involve us deep in folly. All idolatry is not only treacherous, but also futile. Human desire, deep and restless and seemingly unfulfillable, keeps stuffing itself with finite goods, but these cannot satisfy. If we try to fill our hearts with anything besides the God of the universe, we will find that we are overfed but undernourished, and that day by day, week by week, year by year, we are thinning down to a mere outline of a human being.
It's profound.
And we keep pursuing those things, and we just become, like we see at the end of the story with Laban, just hollow. And we have examples of this all over the place in our culture. I think we see it on our screens as we scroll. But I wonder how many times we actually stop to reflect on, like, is that who I'm becoming by the choices that I'm making?
Yeah. I think most people don't look at their work as a vocation. I think they look at their work as a job, and it's just something that I have to do. That question's asked all the time. Do you live to work or do you work to live? And it was said about the boomers that they live to work. It was said about my generation that we work to live.
I wonder what it said about the millennials and Gen Z.
Just don't work.
Just
kidding.
Yikes.
But isn't it true, though, you encounter people who do get it, and it's a transformative experience.
Yeah.
If you're at the checkout line at a grocery store and somebody who sees it as a calling, you almost sense the way they interact with you and the way they do their job is like, this is bigger than just running my groceries through this line.
Just putting my time in.
Yes.
You can feel
making my money.
It's powerful.
Yes.
It's almost palpable. Like,
oh, yes.
You get it. There's something deeper here. You understand that there's this human honor, dignity that's implicit in this work you're doing. And even though a society assigns all sorts of different valuations based upon the monetary outlay of it, you got it. You understand that you, as a human being with a soul, is doing something. You're doing something good.
Yeah. So I didn't come to this text thinking it was going to be about work and wages too. Like, I don't know if it convinced you guys, but the text convinced me that this was one of the main points here. And especially how often the word work is used.
Yeah.
And wages is actually the word that's used the most. How are we to think about wages in light of work? Well, I didn't address that.
Yeah.
I addressed the work aspect. I did not address the wages part of it. But work and wages are always tied together.
Yeah. Not always. I mean, I'll take a slight sharp right-hand turn and say that when I think about it, for a lot of years of my life, and I know there's a lot of people that can relate to this, I was a stay-at-home mom. So there's a lot of work that you do that doesn't really necessarily equate to wages. And I think a lot of us do a lot of work in a sense that doesn't yield like a monetary reward in a sense. But I think it's equally important for people that are stay-at-home moms or even stay-at-home dads to understand that there's a moment where, wiping up crumbs underneath the kitchen table for like the 11th time that day, that can become like a cathedral, a space of worship.
Amen.
Because do it as unto the Lord, all of it. So sometimes there's absolutely no wages involved. Like there's no like immediate earthly reward. And I think in parenting, I just know for me, one of my favorite verses was when I was raising my kids, do not grow weary in doing good, for in due time you will reap what you have sown. So there's a certain sense in which all work as unto the Lord is a sowing that will eventually yield a reaping, even if it's not until eternity. So there's a lot of work that we all do that's for the kingdom of heaven that doesn't equate to wages in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
So can I tie these two ideas together then? Because I think in our cultural moment, work is inherently tied to our wages. And so we value our work based on our wages. So the higher the wage, the more honorable the work. And therefore we've devalued the work of a mother. I mean, and we see this everywhere. I mean, we literally are screaming from the mountaintops in our culture at women that if they are not a career woman, like that is invaluable. I mean, I could be wrong, but this is what I see. And so I find that there's two consequences to this. Number one, and I've seen it in my own life. I've seen it with Mallory, who was a nurse and now is a stay-at-home mom for a season. Will probably go back to being a nurse. That when she is scraping up the crumbs for the 11th time today, there's kind of like an anxiety to get to something where she's producing something. There's a deep frustration when there isn't something that's being done that's moving the ball forward in life, because she's been inundated with these ideas that work doesn't matter. Then on the flip side, when dads come home and they leave their work and they come home, they then see the work as being a father as less valuable because they aren't getting paid for that. And so that has a consequence to it as well. So on one hand, you have a whole group of people, and of course this is a vast generalization, in women who are at home doing day in, day out work that has no wages, and they see it as less valuable. And then the men come home and they see the work at home as less valuable, and so they're less available as husbands and fathers.
Yeah. And it works vice versa too. There's some men that stay at home and women that work, but yeah.
And there's a third component to that as well. So when I resigned from my work as an HR manager, I kind of took on all the household responsibilities on top of the other things I was doing. I remember getting so frustrated. I was doing the shopping, I was doing the cooking, I was doing all this kind of stuff, and I'm like, man, this really stinks. Like, this is hard. And then I'm like, oh wait, women have been doing this for millennia. It's one of those moments of like, I'm here complaining because I've had to do this for the last 2 or 3 years, and this is what women have faithfully done for so many years. And it just brought this incredible perspective of the beauty of that work. Mm-hmm. But there's a third component. It's not just simply that we've created a culture whereby which women sort of undervalue the raising their kids because it's not producing something or gaining some type of income. Men but it's what in effect happens is we take our kids and we ship them off to daycare, and we make other people raise our kids, because the value is found when I go and make a paycheck. And so in effect we miss one of the most incredible callings God has given us, to raise our kids. Nobody else has been given that call, but we send our kids to somebody else because we find the value in the paycheck as opposed to the beauty of the long, hard work of raising our kids to love Jesus.
Yeah.
And so they're the ones who pay the price ultimately for those decisions.
Yeah. Wow.
Heavy stuff.
I agree.
Yeah, I remember when, obviously, I was a stay-at-home mom for a long time. I got to start working at Crossroads 2 days a week early on to work with the kids ministry. So for me, that was the perfect balance of having, some time where I'd get out of the house and have some adult conversation and get to work on a project. And it actually made my time at home feel way more weighty and meaningful. So that was a great balance for us. But for years, I did all the grocery shopping, and now we're empty nest. And so Rod has started helping out with some of those kinds of things, and he actually loves it. He's like, it's Friday night, let's go to the grocery store. Like, he loves grocery shopping, and I'm just like,
Good for
okay,
you.
I've been grocery
That's awesome.
shopping for like 20 years. It's not super fun anymore, but Rod just picks up products. He's like, look at this would be delicious. And I'm like, it's awesome that I get help now and that he actually enjoys it and loves it. But this like novel for Rod, and this thing that I've been doing for so long and has brought me into the doldrums. Now all of a sudden Rod thinks it's really fun. It's good.
Hey, it's my time to carry the baton. Let's go.
It's your time to shine.
Let's go.
Well, it's like you going to his umping. He's now coming with you to like the full circle, right?
Exactly.
But this brings up actually a perfect point, because our vocations are constantly changing. You know, now Rod's
Yep.
vocation is on Friday, he goes to Fresh Time.
There you go.
And
D&W.
but that was okay. There we go.
Shout out to D&W.
Yeah. But I mean, so it's constantly shifting. So we need a thread that pulls through all of that, right? And that's where we get this, a faithful, long obedience in the same direction. Which is why I loved when we had Dr. Sitzer on the podcast and he talked about the will of God as a way of life. That he described one of the ways that he becomes attentive to this is just like pausing for a moment, whatever he's doing, and seeking God's face in that moment. So whatever he's doing, whether it's bagging groceries or cleaning up the crumbs on the floor for the 11th time or teaching a class at Whitworth, like, okay, God, you're here and you have work for me to do. I want to seek your face in that, which I know is very like ethereal and almost mystical. But I mean, I think they're, especially in our fast-paced world, like I don't do that often, even when I come in here to do, in air quotes, spiritual work.
Yeah. Let's talk wages. Is our worth and our wages connected? Our value and our wages connected? Because I think that's a big part of what wages communicate. I value you this much. Here's what you're getting paid. And in one sense, as Christians, we're to get our worth totally from God. But there's a sense, too, in which we would like for also, I don't know, the people around us, the place we work, the people over us to say, this is how much I value you. And is that wrong? And then I also think, if it isn't wrong, people who are responsible for other people's wages better really take long, hard thoughts about how they're communicating value. If you're communicating value, if you're communicating enough value. I mean, just in terms of our culture itself, we can say if you're an NBA basketball player, we value you. You know, if you're a professional athlete, football player, we value you. If you're a school teacher, we value you this much. And again, school teacher then has to say, okay, my worth is not my wages, but yet there is a sense in which wages communicate worth.
But the NBA basketball player on the flip side doesn't have to say that, because they're making so much that I mean, this again, generalization, but they can go, yeah, I got the $50 million contract and this guy got the $75 million contract. So he is worth more than me. You don't, I'm saying that you're saying the teacher has to walk in and say, my worth is not my wages.
The teacher has the opportunity to look at something bigger in life.
Where I'm saying it's harder for the professional athlete probably to not do that, because the cultural currency is such where we have sports talk shows every single day for hours that are talking about someone's worth based on their wages. Anyway, I'm just saying, like,
yeah. I just think we have to find a Christian way to think about this. And it is going to also push us into politics. It's going to push us into economics. And again, we're not Greek. We're not just, Christianity isn't just relegated to a spiritual world. It's the whole world, which includes economics and politics and things like that. So I don't even know where I'm going with this.
Do you think the widow's offering might give us a little picture into, I don't know, that's the first thing in Mark chapter 12?
I think the idea of wages being a form of valuation is essential. I mean, that's what we have said in society we value, right? I mean, money is the currency by which we interact in life, right? We don't barter things anymore. So I think it has to be a measure of valuation.
Yeah.
And it is a means by which our work is worth something, right? But it was really interesting when I was an HR manager. I knew what everybody made, which was a little bit odd. And it's so funny because people in the front office, and this was something I commented on, if they went away, the business would continue to run. And they represented, the 15 or 20 people up there represented about 40% of the income outlay for that company. But if you took that same amount of people away from the floor, the business would come to a screeching halt. Yeah. The machines would stop running, the product would stop coming through, and we would have nothing to ship.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating because what they made on the floor was not in anywhere comparable to what was being made in the front office. And we say, well, the management is essential. We need to really value those people. And I think, the way our society is structured, that does happen. But it was so eye-opening for me to see these people in that space who are really running the machines. And there's an expertise there that they were making basically minimum wage or a little bit above that. And I was like, that's unique to me, that we don't value the people who are producing the work as opposed to people who are quote unquote managing it.
Yeah, interesting.
And
that's a interesting phenomena.
Yeah, it is, and it's rampant everywhere, right? You get to a certain point where you've moved into upper levels of management, and you end up doing less in some respect or producing less, but you make more. Whereas the people who are really responsible for the product, they're the ones in the bottom line, or they're the ones at the bottom of that pecking order.
Yeah. And now we're talking about justice.
There is an equity, and what does that look like in a space where you do need the visionaries and you do need people who run and handle the majority of that responsibility. But man, the disparity between what people at the bottom are making and people at the top, it's jaw dropping.
Yeah. And the prophets talk about this kind of stuff, and they talk about wages and how you're not treating your workers fairly and justly. I just think Christians today, we need to not just relegate Christianity to our spiritual world, but we have to become a counterculture that's radically different from the world and how we do everything, from marriage to family to how we run our companies to all of it, and how we work.
What does generosity look like? How do we live like our Father? How do we be generous like Him?
Yes.
And find those avenues instead of thinking like, okay, I used to be able to live at this income level. Now that I make more, we just adjust our lifestyles as opposed to saying, no, what if my lifestyle stays more static, and what I do with the rest of that, now I can be more generous. I can be more kingdom focused. And I'm having the conversation with my oldest, who's now got a job, and I'm no longer having to pay for him, which is a beautiful thing. But we're having the conversation, what are you going to do now that you have a job and you're going to make money, and how are you going to handle that? And he's like, Dad, I really would love to have that conversation, because on the outset of him being, in the workforce, having to process what I do with his paycheck is a really important question, and how to help him navigate that and shepherd him through that process is really important.
And this is one thing I noticed in Jacob too, who's on the other end of that. He's Laban's the one who's the boss, determining the wages. Jacob's the one who is the laborer. And I read those verses on Sunday, but as I looked at him, where he gives that speech to his wife.
And Laban or no, Jacob.
Yeah, Jacob. He gives the speech to his wives. No, I'm sorry. Jacob gives the speech to Laban. And he says, I've been with you for 20 years now. Your sheep and goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten any food from your flocks. I did not bring you animals back to you that were torn by wild beasts. I bore those losses myself. You demanded payment from me for whatever was stolen by day or night. And then he says, let me tell you about day or night. This was my situation. The heat consumed me in the daytime and the cold at night, and sleep fled from my eyes. It was like this for 20 years that I was in your household. I worked. He worked. He worked hard.
Yeah.
And he didn't complain, and he had a great attitude.
And there's Jesus the parable of the vineyard and the workers in the vineyard is kind of along these same, it's not the same thing at all, but we can also become offended by God's generosity. That's what that parable is about in a nutshell, right? Like, okay, I'm going to hire all these workers. Some are going to work starting at 7 in the morning. Some are going to start working at 12, and I'm going to pay them all denarius. And then some of them come back and they're like, why'd they get a denarius? And he's like, well, the whole parable starts with the kingdom of heaven is like, and then God is obviously the master over all of the workers. And he's like, isn't it my like discretion what I give these people? The first will be last, the last will be first. And so I think when we express radical generosity too, like there's an offensive nature to that, because ultimately we're saying that we're just going to pour upon people things that at times they don't deserve or they didn't work for.
Yep.
And interestingly enough too, Rod, that speech that he gives to Laban is the one that very similar he gave to his wives earlier, right?
Yes.
And it's fascinating because you kind of brought this out on Sunday. It's a turning point for him, right? Like, are my wives going to side with their dad or with me? And it's fascinating because almost instantaneously they say, yeah, we've seen what our dad does.
Yeah, he treats us like a slave.
And so in so many ways, his faithfulness in this job spoke to them.
Yes.
And they allied themselves with him because they saw a man who was faithful in his work despite being taken advantage of over and over again.
Wow.
And that's, in some ways, the beauty of when we work unto the Lord, it is visible to others, and it's transformative because people don't do that in this world.
Oh, it's so good. And Leah spoke first as the older, and she has been the unloved one by Jacob, and yet she is the
Still
one
acknowledged.
to say, we're going with you. We've watched you. You've won our hearts.
I know in this story that Rachel is the most loved one by Jacob, but I just have to say that I fully respect Leah in her posture and who she is, and because we see this even here with Rachel, like she's the one that's taken the household idols, right? She's still kind of got one, and talk about idols that have no power. She's actually sitting on these idols that they worship, which is really interesting. But Rachel, in my opinion, throughout this whole story, and we'll continue in the fall when we step back into Genesis, we'll conclude the story of Rachel. But she actually is pretty immature, and she ends up dying on the side of the road, and Jacob has to bury her in a certain place. And it's actually Leah who's buried with Jacob as the matriarch of the Israelite nation in the tombs with the fathers, with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Leah is the one that's buried in that place of honor. She's the one that, has Judah, the son that's going to then produce the Messiah. So I like to make a case for Leah sometimes in the sense that even though she's unloved in this sense, the eternal, what she's sown and what she's reaping are massive. And Rachel, who has all the goods this side of heaven in a sense, is misguided, ends up being, along the wayside. Although I don't want to diss her too badly, but I do like to make a case for Leah, that Leah is the one who birthed, the father of David, the father of Jesus, through that line. And she's the one that has that place of burial in the tomb of the patriarchs. So shout out to Leah.
Yeah, love it.
She did her work well.
She did.
Yeah.
So one of the things that it's going a little off base, but can we talk about this monument and covenant that's set up at the end of the text to kind of tie a bow on where we're going, where we're ending in Genesis and then where we're going? What's going on here? So when Laban's like, okay, I want to set up these standing stones, let's make a covenant. This is in verses 45 to 55 in chapter 31. What's going on there between Laban and Jacob?
Yeah, so
and he's like, you don't come back past this.
Yeah, so Jacob finds out that his wives and children are willing to go with him. At that moment, it's like, good, we're going. And he leaves the next day. And remember, Laban's already put a 3-day journey between the two, just so that Jacob can't sneak or snooker him in any kind of way. And so he gets a 7-day start, but Laban tracks him down. And Laban has actually the physical power. He has his sons, all of that. And he, I think, is coming to maybe kill him. And they go toe to toe. And the fact that God gives Laban that dream just before, the night before he catches up with Jacob, where God basically says, don't you touch him. And that combined with Jacob standing up to him, Laban drops the sword. And then they even go the next level of making a covenant. And I think this is because Laban doesn't want to burn all bridges with his daughters or his sister. And this is just a covenant-making ceremony, just like God made a covenant with Abraham, which was followed by a meal. This is the way you do it in the ancient world. In fact, I think it's even more than that. They have a technical term for a certain kind of meal, which is a meal of reconciliation. Lib, what's that called again?
Sulha.
A sulha. And they still do it to this day in the Middle Eastern world. In fact, one time in Israel, we were in kind of a hot spot, and there was tons of traffic, and our bus driver is so protective of us and our group. And I'm looking at him, and he's trying to just protect our group from people trying to cut in, and then it ends up being like a scuffle and yelling back and forth with the taxi driver next to him. And then the taxi driver gets out of his car, bus driver opens his window, and he comes in, punches him, and his glasses fall off.
Yeah, the taxi driver punched our bus driver.
It was just a really weird moment. Like,
yeah.
My goodness.
Shocking.
Yes. And yeah, we're going to a site literally on the Mount of Olives, and he drops us off, and we do our whole Palm Sunday story right there. By the time I come back, I said, Yigal, are you okay? He goes, yes. The taxi driver found me with his brother, and we had a meal together, a sulha, and a meal of reconciliation. And basically the table's prepared. And the moment the person who's been hurt picks a morsel or the cup in his hand and puts it in his mouth, reconciliation. He's basically saying, I forgive you, I love you, I accept you, we are reconciled. And so that's what's going on. It goes all the way back to this story.
Powerful.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and God will say to David, I prepare a table in the presence of your enemies. And speaking of the prodigal, this is the kind of meal the father wants to have with his son. Is a sulha, a meal of reconciliation. My son's home. Let's just reconcile. So the Lord's table, really.
Yeah.
I was wondering
This is the cup.
The sulha.
with
It's a
Judas,
Yes.
the one to whom I dip.
It's exactly what's going on. Yeah. So
It's beautiful.
Well, this is where sometimes I get jealous of like the Eastern versus the Western, like Rod talked about earlier, the Greek, the Western separation of physical and spiritual, and the Eastern, there's like no separation. All of life is a metaphor. The physical life is just a metaphor for the spiritual life. So sometimes when we enter that environment, or we look at scriptures that way, or we're in Israel or in an Eastern context, I just get a little bit jealous because we just don't have a lot of those deep, meaningful traditions like that sulha, that meal. If you understand what it's been since the time of Genesis all the way through, and like you, Brent, just brought up the Last Supper with Christ, like you can see the beauty of a covenant meal and the full, robust picture of what that material means, like the eating of that food, which is very real and tangible, and the drinking of the cup, which is very real and tangible, but the spiritual weight that holds. And I sometimes I'm just jealous, like we just don't have, and even honestly, the Lord's Supper communion as we take as a community is a sulha. It's a reconciliation. It's like a reminder of the way that he's reconciled us to himself. And so we do employ some of those metaphors, but I don't know if we fully understand the representation that all of the physical really has for the spiritual.
yeah, and I think about that story I just told. Yigal, our bus driver's Jewish, and the person that punched him was Palestinian. Just think if we could get back to the table again and have sulha and just reconciliation meals of reconciliation, as opposed to wars.
Boy, that would change the world.
Yeah. Christian, this is what we're called to live into. This is what we're called to be in our world.
This is your work.
And going back to your point, Libby, this is why I think sometimes it'd be good for us to approach the Lord's table with a little bit more reverence. You know, when Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 says that we are to examine ourselves before we take that, I don't think that's just an examine of my relationship with God. Am I reconciled? Have I confessed my sins? Have I repented of things that are dirty within me? But I think it's also an examination of my relationships with brothers and sisters.
Paul says right there, he says, you are to recognize the body before you take in the body of Jesus Christ. In other words, you are to look at your place in the body of Jesus. And don't lay your gift down at the altar, says Jesus, unless if you have someone to reconcile with. Like get it done before you take communion. Before you take in the body of Jesus, get it all right with the body of Jesus. That's Paul's instruction.
And to that point too, I've always wondered, this last supper that was really kind of the framework for our communion. All the disciples are asking the question, am I going to be the one who betrays him?
Yeah.
Am I the one who is going to make this all go south? And I wonder if we actually approach communion from that angle of, am I the one?
Yeah.
Is it me? Because that's the question that's hanging over this whole meal. Who's going to be the one who betrays him? And I wondered if we brought kind of the idea of reverence, but almost this idea of like, what does that look like? What does betrayal look like? What does it mean to flee in that moment? And I wondered if that kind of would just bring a different framework for us as we approach communion. Of Lord, what ways have I?
Yeah. Wow, you give me some
abandoned you?
ideas for Sunday, taking communion, things that we can push into our people and live into that are along these lines of Suha.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, Brent, so good having you here
Thank
on
you
the
so
Thank you
table.
so
much.
much, Brent.
And what a beautiful way to end the first half of our series on Genesis. Where are we going from here, Rod?
Excited.
And why are we splitting it up?
Just because we can. It's a long book, and we just thought,
it's
you know
good.
what? Part 1, part 2 might be helpful, just so people don't get too bogged down into it. And we have a 3-week series with Joe Stoll, who's on joy, and I just think, wow, here's another person. What a gift that he comes to our church, and that a man who's so full of joy at, 81 years old, Lib?
80, yeah.
Yeah. Gets to teach us, and his joys in the Lord gets to teach us that. And then we're starting a series after that on Ephesians. And then we'll pick up Genesis 32 the week after Labor Day.
Which, if you want to talk about a book that's going to absolutely blow open this Greek idea of the bifurcation of two realities, Ephesians is the book to do it. So excited for that. Thanks for listening to all you guys out there that are journeying through Genesis with us.
Yeah.
And it's been fun for us. Hopefully it's been edifying for you. Brent, as I said before, so grateful that you're not only at this table, but that you're at the table of Crossroads, that
Amen.
you serve here.
Thank
I'm
you
just
for having
humbled.
me.
I'm just humbled by your witness of, the life of Christ in you and what the Spirit of God is doing in your life, your family's life. And I want to be more like you. So,
Amen. Amen.
well, thanks for being with us. This is the Locker Room, where we break down sermons, stories, and scripture for the race of our faith. If this podcast has been serving you, hit follow and the notification bell. That way you can stay up to date on all new episodes. We love you, Crossroads. See ya.